Well, today for Medium Giant, we do have my partners, Heather Parker, who I call the head lead and best strategist that I've ever known in 30 plus years in this marketplace. And we have Sean Parnell, who's what I just term a big wig. He's a be all know all of digital marketing in this marketplace. He is going to lead the meeting today and talk about Google Analytics. I understand that's a subject that's very near and dear to all of y'all's hearts, that you would like to know a little bit more. And I admittedly am not an expert at Google Analytics. I can work my way around, but as I perused the deck, I was excited to even learn a few things that I didn't know. So hang on tight. There were some questions that you submitted that you were interested in answers, and Sean has most definitely included those at the end of a little bit of 101 and answered those questions too. So if okay with you, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Sean Parnell. And Jonathan, I don't see where I can share my deck in the top right-hand corner as you indicated. So can you drive?
Yeah, that won't be a problem.
Thank you.
Make sure how I get this to present.
We're very familiar with Zoom, but we are not so familiar with Teams. There you go.
That's all right. Okay, so can y'all see my screen here? I'm sure there's a way to actually make this show full screen. My wife would know for sure. She's a Google.
Yeah, Jonathan, I can probably share my screen because I intended to make it a bit more active in the sense that we can actually jump into Google Analytics and look at things directly in here.
Okay, great.
I definitely want this to be as interactive and helpful as possible. We're going to give a really brief overview of Google Analytics and the various parts of the UI. Just, not knowing where everybody's coming from kind of an experience perspective. But very quickly, I expect us to kind of dovetail into, let's get into some specific questions, and you can always submit those questions either from the chat or even just chime in. And if necessary, I can jump over into actual Google Analytics account and we can kind of do some live driving, which I always find to be much more helpful in these situations than me trying to screenshot everything I can find from the interface. So with that, I'm going to share my screen real quick and make sure that everybody can see. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
With the slideshow on?
Yeah. Yes, I can.
All right, so my name is Sean Parnell. I'm the head of media and analytics here at Medium Giant, formerly Below and Company. So I basically manage the teams and the processes around our service offering in terms of how we help clients with analytics implementations, understanding their data, media tracking, and then also we run media across paid search, paid social, programmatic display, email, you name it. And we try to do that in a holistic way that allows us to help drive value for our clients, usually through the digital space. So we're going to get into Google Analytics 101. If you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to just chime in. And then Sandra, I am on full screen, so I'm not seeing the chat. If we have questions that come through the chat, feel free to interrupt me and say we have a question, and we can do it like that. Is that okay?
Got you. You bet.
All right. So Google Analytics is a lot of different moving parts. I'm a big fan of the Office. You can apply it to just about everything. So you'll see a few Office things throughout this. But let's get started looking at all of the various elements here. We're going to start at kind of the highest of high levels, right? So in our agenda, we're going to look at just an overview of how accounts and profiles and views work. We're going to talk a little bit about terms and definitions that are important to kind of understand the differences between. We're going to talk a little bit about session data, right, and looking at it from that lens, because Google Analytics is almost like looking at a ball. You can look at it from a lot of different directions in order to determine kind of the answers to the questions that you have, and then to also understand the overall flow of the users throughout your website. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about events and goals, because events and goals are the primary way that we really understand what people are doing on the website and when they're doing what we want them to do. And then we're going to spend some time answering questions and then maybe even do some live driving in a Google Analytics account if it comes up. And we want to jump into that. So to get started, Google Analytics uses hierarchical structures for organizing data. So it takes like all of your web data, and we're going to start breaking it down into various pieces, right, to understand and dissect and glean insights about what's going on. At the highest level, there's basically 3 levels of organization. You can have accounts, you can have properties, and you can have views. Typically, you'll see a single kind of business or an organization will have, one core account, but oftentimes there may be multiple accounts if there's multiple websites being managed under a single umbrella. Accounts is the highest level of the hierarchy, and then accounts can be subdivided into what are called properties. And then each level has basically the ability, each property can be filtered to a specific subset of the overarching data being collected by the account. So when you put a Google Analytics tag on a website, you are, basically, lumping that data in with a specific account. And then we use the configuration within Analytics to break that down into profiles or properties, and then properties can be further subdivided into views, right? And a view is basically a subset of a specific property. The strategy behind how one or more websites is structured in this way really depends on kind of your data and your stakeholder objectives of the organization at large. So you could have 10 websites and 10 accounts, or you could have 10 websites and 1 account and 10 properties. It really depends on kind of what you're trying to accomplish, especially in terms of like an holistic overview of performance. Any questions on that before we move forward? Great. Well, next one. So within a particular view, this hierarchy continues to get broken down into individual views that allow marketers to understand the story behind the web traffic, right? And so we fundamentally break this down into kind of 4 different core categories according to Google Analytics, right? It wants you to think about it in terms of audiences and what you can understand about the people who are visiting your website, right? What are their attributes? Are they men? Are they women? What kind of interests do they have according to the Google data on them? What content are they looking at? The second major section is about acquisition, meaning what can I understand about where these users are coming from and how well does traffic coming from different places tend to convert? And so this acquisition section is really one of the core sections that marketers tend to look at when trying to understand, is the marketing effort I'm doing having the impact that I want it to have, right? The third major section of the Google Analytics UI is behaviors, right? And the behaviors answers questions about what actions do users take when they're visiting the site content, and what content is attracting the most visitors and keeping them engaged. And so this is where we get into the concept of tracking events and understanding kind of the behavior of people once they are actually on your site. And so that behavior could be looking at content, that behavior could be watching videos, that behavior could be logging into their account, that behavior could be submitting their email address for more information. Your website has a lot of different things for people to do, and you want to really track those things really well so that you understand, are we bringing the right people to the website based on what we're giving them to do? And also, like, do we have enough for them to do to help achieve our overarching goal? And ultimately, all of that leads into the final section, major section of Google Analytics, which is our conversions, right? Every website has kind of a core goal, right? Like, as a website owner, right, you want people to come to your site in order to do something. What is that something, and how do we know when they've done it? Because most of the, so for an e-commerce site, that's very simple. We want them to buy something. For a college website, that could be a bit more nuanced and depend on a lot of different types of audiences. And so we leverage very robust tracking in order to be able to kind of understand, is each specific audience that would come to my site doing what I expect them to do? And if they're not, how can I help them through that process, either through improving the site experience or by potentially bringing in a different type of person in the first place? Any questions on this?
Can I ask a question real quick? Do most
Sure.
colleges have what Dallas College has, which is a Jonathan in place for site digital experience, the user's experience on the site, or is that a new position that's coming into play? Because as Sean mentioned, sometimes the how we convert the users or the target audience within the site has to do with the user experience itself. Okay, some people are commenting, no, we don't. Okay, that's interesting just to know, because I am curious how colleges address that when there are site issues that need to be addressed to help with conversions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the website is an experience ultimately, and that experience is designed to get a person to do something in most cases, right? And so your website structure, obviously, and the friction of that experience will have an ultimate impact on how well you're able to get people to do what you want them to do. As marketers, sometimes you have very little control over the website experience itself, and you have more control over how do we market to a certain type of person in order to get them to the website, knowing that our experience is what it is, right? So you kind of want to be optimizing both sides of this. You want to be optimizing your website experience, um, through content and structure and usability, and then you also want to be optimizing your marketing programs to making sure that you're not just screaming through a bullhorn on the internet to anybody who will listen, and that you're actually targeting people who are qualified to actually have interest in what you want them to do. Okay, so we move on to the next section, right? Some key terms and definitions, right? Like we always think of things in terms of buckets, right? We have a bucket of users, we have a bucket of acquisition, like how we get those users to the site, and then we have a bucket of events and goals in terms of how we or what those users do once they're at the site, right? So for a user's perspective, we have this concept of a session, and the session is basically a single period of time when a specific user is actively engaged with the website, right? So that you go to the website and you stay for 5 minutes and you do a couple of things and then you leave. And that's considered one session for one user. Now, if that user comes back to the site and has another session, then that would be two sessions for a single user. So a user is an individual person who has initiated one or more sessions within a specific time period, right? And a session is the individual time that they spent on the site in that single moment, right? And the last big kind of key term to understand is the concept of a bounce rate, right? And a bounce rate is the percentage of sessions of people who leave the site immediately without doing anything, right? So if your bounce rate is low, that's a good thing. If your bounce rate is high, that's a bad thing. That means that the experience isn't what those users want, and that they are basically getting to the page, recognizing very quickly that this was not for them, and hitting the back button, right? And getting out of there. And that can be for a number of different reasons, right? That could be either because we targeted the wrong people in the first place and they never should have been there in the first place, or we targeted the right people, but we put them in the wrong spot on the site, right? And that they can't do what they really wanted to do, or it's not what they wanted to do, even though they are kind of a qualified visitor. And so we take all these things under consideration when we optimize marketing programs and website content in order to be able to generate the best experience. From the acquisition side of things, right, all inbound traffic can be broken down into a couple of different key elements, right? The source, right, is a known place online that a user comes from when visiting the website, right? Now, this source could be Google, it could be Facebook, it could be any number of different places that a user is coming from, right? That we have identified as a place that we want to track where they're coming from, right? A medium is a kind of a collection of sources into a purposeful grouping for holistic insight. So, for example, a medium of social could be a grouping of all the social media related sources, right? TikToks, Facebook, Pinterest, all of that can be grouped together into a single group to see how social media traffic compares to, let's say, paid search traffic. And so you can start to group inbound data into different groups to achieve different various levels of insight. The next level down in terms of understanding where traffic is coming from is the campaign. And a campaign is a subdivision of sources into basically a grouping and is typically related to kind of outbound media programs that may be running, and that includes like email. This includes instances where you're creating a way for users to visit the site, and you're able to structure the way that that traffic is recognized, so that you understand that it came from you, right? So in paid search, right, you have different search campaigns, and those would come in as the campaign. If you're running display or social, you may tag your social ads with UTM parameters to identify which social campaign it came from, right? And the next two layers down are keyword and content, right? Keyword and content were originally kind of really built out to be focused around paid search, so that you could understand what keyword the user was searching on when they came to your site. And then also, so you know what kind of ad content you put in front of them, which caused them to do the click. That being said, the UTM keyword and UTM content kind of parameters are basically just different ways to further subdivide inbound traffic. So just because you run a social media campaign doesn't mean you can't use the keyword parameter in order to understand something specific, right? It really just depends on kind of what your goals are and what strategy you're providing. The last piece of acquisition to really understand is the concept of a refer, right? And a refer is the unique domain that website traffic is coming from, right? And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because a refer is a type of medium, right? And a refer has different sources. And so when you think about inbound traffic, it's either coming from its own volition, meaning I was on Facebook and some blogger linked over here, and the marketing team had nothing to do about it, and they made it to the site anyway, right? That's kind of a refer as a medium, compared to I put an ad in front of somebody and I did that on Facebook and they came from Facebook, but they came by way of my ad, and so I'm tagging that separately from a refer because I controlled that experience in order to attract them. So this is where it can get a little bit tricky, and we often kind of have to understand the nuances behind kind of how we're tracking things from an outbound media perspective. But these are the 6 kind of key things to always keep in mind, and really try to get a firm understanding of whenever you're looking at anything within the UI.
Sean, we have a couple of questions surrounding bounce rate.
Yeah.
Is the time frame for bounces, say, like 1 minute?
I think it's adjustable, but I think it's like actually more like 1 second as a default. And I think that also can be adjusted in the admin configuration to some extent. So same thing with like, how long does a user have to be on the site for it to be considered a session, and before a session would like reset, right? Is it 1 day? Is it 2 days? Is it a week before it's considered a new session? Because oftentimes you have people come to the site, stay for a time, leave, but come back the same day. Do you consider that a new session, or do you consider that the same session? And a lot of those things can be configured at the administration level based on kind of how you view your business.
Second question, is the bounce rate strictly for site-wide sessions, or can it also be insights on a particular page as well?
It can be on a particular page as well.
Good question.
So yeah, the bounce rate is a global metric, but you can look at it through a filtered lens of individual pages or groups of pages. If you're kind of evaluating how strong is this content. And you can also look at it through the lens of like marketing channels, right? My display bounce rate is significantly higher than my paid search bounce rate because I'm interrupting people with my ads as opposed to people who are actively in market searching. So the bounce rate is an important metric to kind of keep tabs on, and you can do it at various levels of detail depending on kind of what insight you're looking to glean.
Hey, Sean, and maybe just a clarifying question for me on the bounce rate. So when you say that the bounce rate can be 1 second, essentially the bounce rate is they could be on the site for 1 second and leave without doing anything, or they could be on the site for 10 minutes and basically hit that page and not do anything. It still counts as a bounce. Is that correct?
Yes. And there's obviously rules and limitations around that. So
Right.
Again, I mean, that I can follow up with the specific details around bounce rates, but generally speaking, it's you know, somebody who comes to the site doesn't, or that page doesn't do anything and leaves immediately. And so, but what you determine to be immediately and what you determine to be not doing anything is configurable to some degree.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. The last set of key. Oh, is that all for the questions on bounce rate?
Yes,
No,
that's what that was in chat.
I'm sorry, I was getting ready to just add one question. When I'm Deborah McGoy, I'm at Houston Community College. And I just wanted to ask, when you talk about bounce rate, are you talking about them doing absolutely nothing, like not even a click? Does that mean that?
Yes. Yes. Typically it means that the user did not click on anything. They got to the site, they stayed, you know, not even long enough to be able to do anything for the most part in most cases. And then they left the site, right, to go somewhere else, right? They landed on the site and they bounced away. If they do anything, that's not going to be considered a bounce. That's going to be considered a bounced session. That's going to be considered an active session.
So a scroll, as somebody is writing now, or a click, that would not be counted as a bounce.
A click for sure would not be counted as a bounce. I think a scroll, you would be there long enough to where it's not counted as a bounce. And again, there's really technical definitions in Google support documentation that we can provide as a follow-up. You know, but yeah, generally speaking, if they're doing anything, that's not going to be considered a bounced session.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Events and goals.
Great. So the third bucket of terms, and the one that's really important to understand, are the concepts of events and the concept of goals, right? And events are purposely tracked actions on the site that may or may not be related to the core website objectives. So for example, your website may be designed to get people to submit a lead form with the ultimate goal of getting them to enroll. Right. Now, that being said, you may provide them some kind of cost calculator on the site so that they can calculate cost and show why it's cost effective to do what you want them to do. Well, the act of using the cost calculator is an event that they're taking while they're on your site. And that's something that you can track to various levels of granularity. And events are divided into basically three different parts, right? There's the action itself, and that action can be a click, it can be a video view, it can be, user entered their email address, it can be a button that they clicked on, it can be anything like that. A category is basically a grouping of actions into a purposeful group for a specific insight. So an event category could be something like, video views, right? If you have multiple videos and your action is they looked at video 1, your action they looked at video 2. And then label is basically a way of describing the action taken by the user. So the user clicked on this button. Well, what button did they click on? And what was that button intended to do? And so these are really intended to be very flexible in terms of how you use them. But the whole point of it is to say that anything a user can do on your site, you're going to want to track it as an event, because the more events that users do, the more engaged they are with your site, the more likely they are to do the ultimate event that you want them to do. And so that ultimate event typically comes in the form of goals, right? And goals are the end all be all goal of the website. Our goal of the website is to get a person to do such and such typically, right? And so that constitutes one or more specific actions taken by users that indicate the core objective has been completed. And so goals break down into two different elements. They break down into completions, which is the number of times that action occurs. So if your goal is a lead form getting submitted so that somebody can go call them, then the number of lead forms getting submitted is the number of completions of that goal. And the goal value is the monetary value associated with the goal action. And sometimes you know what that value is, like they purchased a product from us and that product cost $25. Well, the goal value is $25. In other cases, that value can be a bit more nuanced, right? Like, what is the value ultimately to the business for an individual lead? Well, you can get to a number by backing into it from your enrollment data, or you can just focus on getting as many leads as possible. It's really kind of like up to you as a marketer in terms of how you want to look at your business objectives.
Okay, we're at the halfway mark,
Yep.
30 minutes. So I'll continue to scroll through chat and answer what I can. And Sean, we definitely want to get to their questions at the end.
Yep.
Sure.
Yep. We're going to start breezing through everything here. Just a second. So, all right. So now we've talked about the kind of the four elements. Let's translate that into the UI, right? We have an audience section of the UI, right? Which basically gives me descriptive information about the users visiting the site. And these views can be filtered based on kind of how they're getting to the site to better understand subgroups. And so for marketers, the best sections here to typically look at are the demographic section, the interest section, and the geo section. And the demographic section is going to tell me men versus women and what kind of age groups and all that. And interest is going to be Google determined kind of affinity categories, right? People coming to my site are mostly identified as moms who watch a lot of reality TV, right? It's a bad example, but and then the geo section will tell you where they're coming from, right? Because if you're in Galveston College and you have a lot of inbound traffic coming from Oklahoma, well, that may be something to look into, right? Because is that an opportunity or is that a problem? And if you're a website administrator, you're looking at the sections about behavior, technology, mobile devices, and user flow, because you want to understand what browsers people are using when they visit your site and what devices that they're coming in on, so that you can optimize your website structure, right, to make that experience as frictionless as possible. The next major section of it, and this is a section that marketers tend to spend the most time at, right, is the acquisition tab. And this gives me descriptive information about how users are visiting the site. Many of the subgroups in this tab are directly related to specific Google products. So when you see Google Ads and Search Console, right, those are specific Google products that are tightly integrated with Google Analytics that you can either use because Google is trying to make it as easy for you as possible, or you can ignore and look at just the acquisition traffic by itself. And so the best places for marketers to look at here are the overview, right, the channels, and the referral section to basically get a really good understanding of where this is coming from. And then if you're managing a paid search account that's linked to Google Analytics, right, then the Google Ads section of Google Analytics is where all your AdWords data is basically becoming populated. And so that's a really good section for paid search marketers to look at if they're running paid search campaigns specifically. Any questions on this so far?
Not so far.
Great. So when we look at the UI, right, we're looking at a way of viewing specific subsets of the website data, right? So when we're looking at the acquisitions tab, it's important to understand the differences between dimensions and metrics, right? Metrics are numbers, right? Basically values that represent, certain pieces of information, and dimensions are basically descriptive information about those numbers, right? And so when you're in the UI, you can only ever apply two types of segmentation or two dimensions in a single view of information, right? And then they bucket all the metrics into three core groups, right? Acquisition, the users and how many sessions, the behavior, how many left right away, and how many pages did they look at while they were here. And then conversions, which is, did they do what we wanted them to do, right? And to what degree did that happen? And so a lot of times you have to go in and out of different ways of looking at the information to truly understand the story behind what's going on. And you can look at things by medium only, by source only, by campaign only, or you can look at things in combinations, right? You can look at source medium together in combination with campaign to try to understand how a specific piece of marketing performed on the site and whether it's working for you or not. And then lastly, you can leverage filtering to further drill into groups within this view. So you go to advanced over here, you're able to say, I want to see all the campaigns and keywords for just the paid search medium. And so you can filter to a particular medium and then look at your view in order to kind of understand what you're trying to understand. So this is a really powerful way of breaking down the information, but you have to know what you're looking for. And then there's obviously more or less elegant ways of drilling into that particular piece of information.
So, Sean, the basic view of Google Analytics looks like this for everybody. But if I hear you correctly, depending on what your needs are and how you have your goals and conversion set up, etc., this view could be custom if you know how to custom to what you need to see per page and per view.
Right. You can create custom views to answer specific questions that you're trying to ask of your data.
Okay, great.
Right. And then a lot of that depends on how well the tracking has been set up, especially in terms of like conversion rates and things like that. And so that's why, getting into analytics auditing, is really important, because if you're not tracking events and goals, then you're losing out on a very significant portion of your insight by not doing that. All right. So the next section is the behaviors tab, right? So the next big section. And this allows me to understand what users are doing when they're visiting the site. This is where I go to look at events. Right? The usefulness of the events section really depends on the quality of the strategy and implementation of event tracking. And so some clients and websites, are really tightly buttoned up about this. And then some clients don't use it really effectively, and it becomes a very useless section for them, right? But obviously the best sections to look at for marketers are events, if you're tracking them, because you can see what are the top events that people are doing, what's the stickiest content of my site, and how do I make more of it. And you can look at individual pages to see how specifically created content is working or resonating with the people who are visiting the site. And so again, depending on your role in the marketing process, right? If you're a media buyer, you care more about the acquisitions tab. If you're a content creator, you care more about the behavior on site. And so it really kind of depends on kind of what your role is in terms of how you activate this. When you're looking at events in the UI, right? Again, there are 3 types of event dimensions: event category, event action, and event label. But again, just like with the acquisitions tab, you can only look at 2 types of segmentation at the same time within the same screen, if you will. If you want to look at all 3 together, you have to run that as a separate report using a tool in order to export that. And there's a lot of tools that can help you do that if you want to get it all into a spreadsheet, right? But a lot of times just looking at it in the UI is good enough, and you want to know what you're looking for, right? So again, events have to be implemented by way of a developer and or a tag management solution like Google Tag Manager. So it's not something that you can create from the UI specifically, right? So if you need events created, you typically will have to work through somebody and like a developer or somebody who's working through a tag management solution in order to do it. But events have 4 types of metrics, right? They have the total events, they have the unique events, right? So they click to call phone button, and they clicked it multiple times, right? Well, that's, one unique event. The phone button was clicked, but then it was clicked multiple times, so that could happen multiple times. And then again, you can also configure a monetary value to an event also to be able to, understand kind of like what kind of value that we're driving. Right. The last section of Google Analytics is the conversions tab. And so the conversions tab is where we start to understand goals. And this allows me to understand what goals are getting completed the most often and what those conversion rates are. And goals are segmented by basically source medium in this section in order to understand the best performing sources of inbound traffic. If your website has an e-commerce element to it, then there is a dedicated area of this conversions tab that looks at e-commerce specifically for breaking down transactions into orders and specific products. But I think in the case of most colleges, it's probably more around, student logins and enrollments and lead forms and things like that, which is more goal related as opposed to e-commerce potentially. But it's really kind of up to how your site has been structured. So obviously the best sections to look at here are the overview, so you can see how the goals are performing. But also when we look at the acquisition tab, that also allows you to select a specific goal to see how that specific goal is performing in relation to the overall inbound traffic. So this acquisitions tab from a marketer's perspective is really one of the most powerful places to look in terms of, is what I want to happen happening? And what's the best way that it's happening, basically. The other major part about goals to understand is that goals are different from events to a degree, right? Goals can actually be configured within the UI of Google Analytics itself, whereas events have to be implemented by a web developer or through a tag management solution. And so with goals, right, goals can be triggered to track based on specific page views, like a confirmation page loading, or you can trigger a goal completion to happen from an event that's already been configured. So all goals can be events, right? But not all events need to be goals, right? And it really kind of depends on your strategy. But the main difference is that you can review how a goal has been implemented in the UI itself and make adjustments. But one of the limitations is that you can only have 20 goals working for you at any given time. And those goals can be turned on and off in terms of, are they tracking anything? Whereas with events, you can basically track as many events as you want. So these screens are in the admin section, where as a user, you may or may not have control in terms of editing them, depending on your Google Analytics admin's permissions that have been provided. So again, looking at the goals section, right? When you look at the screen, it basically gives you these top line indicators of how many goals got completed, which goals got completed, what's the goal conversion rate. And this basically tells you how your website's performing, if it's been configured properly. And then again, you break that down into, well, which inbound traffic is performing the best and what's performing the worst, and what can we do about it? Because our ultimate goal is to be driving as many goals as possible. So again, at this, I wanted to take some time to either get into a specific Google account in Live Drive and get some feedback from people in terms of what sections they wanted to talk about, or we can jump into the submitted questions. It's really kind of like up to the group, and Sandra, I'll defer to you if you want to handle this also.
How about we cover submitted questions and then come back to the Live Drive if the questions lead to a need for that?
Sure. We got a handful of questions submitted prior to the call that we basically created and provided some answers to. And so we're going to provide this deck to everybody as a lead find for you to either take back to your teams or go into your own accounts and poke around. And then again, as a follow-up to the meeting, if there are questions after this presentation that you want to get into, or you want to schedule a call to look at specific things, obviously then the right person to get in touch with is Sandra, not Sean, Sandra, just kidding. And that will look at, answering your questions about specific things. And a lot of times it's going to determine how well your tracking has been implemented. And then also, do you understand what questions you want answered? Because if you don't know what questions you want answered about your data, then using a tool to answer them is going to be very difficult for you. So a lot of times we spend a lot of time up front with people trying to help them make sure that they're clear on what they want to know. So
I would like to say something on the heels of that, Sean. We, as a marketing agency and media agency for many clients, that right there is the challenge that we do a lot of user experience auditing. We set up Google Analytics for clients, but to know from the beginning what it is you need to accomplish for which initiative often is the challenge that most people don't know specifically when we start the conversation, which is 90% of the battle, right?
Yeah.
So if you do have a challenge or you don't know how to go about setting up these type of things, we are an entity that does that for many clients, and we can talk about that, and you can reach out to me. But as I've gone through this too, I've related back to other client examples of remembering as we started the challenge of the user experience audit, it was very much the fact that to begin with, it was a question of what did you need to accomplish that needs to be defined at the very beginning. And it's more specific than just a marketing campaign launched that says we need to reach so and so and deliver to these people and convert to click to call or fill out a form. It's more specific in how you strategize and think about it from the beginning versus the normal way we go about thinking. So again, we can help you on the back end if you determine that there are questions like that from the beginning that you have drilled down specific needs for. We're here to help.
Right. And on the flip side of that too, it's okay to not know also a little bit, because part of the help that we can provide is here's how to start thinking about this, even if you don't know what you're even looking for yet, right? And so that becomes more of a conversation about like, well, let's talk about your business, right? And then from there we can start to like say, okay, well, given what we've talked about your business, here's how that would translate into analytics conversation, right? So sometimes but sometimes you don't know, and that's okay too. And you need help like having that conversation.
That's
So
what
again,
Heather does, is
yeah,
takes a top line strategy thought and then drills it down into, okay, if this is what I'm hearing, then this is where we need to go and how that looks on the flip side. That's why I tell you she's the best strategist I've ever worked with. So that's what Sean is referring to, and we're glad to help in that area.
what am I, chopped liver over here? Just kidding.
I love you too, Sean. I just don't get to work with you one-on-one every day like I do Heather.
I know. No, I work with Heather quite a bit on the backside, so that's all great. So what are the key metrics marketers should look for? That was one of the key core questions, right? And from the lens of inbound traffic, you obviously want to keep tabs on your overall session volume. You want your bounce rates to be as low as possible. And there's really no standard benchmark for what a good versus bad bounce rate is, right? But the reality is that especially if you're spending money to drive traffic to your site, you don't want them bouncing if you can help it, right? And either you're spending money in the wrong places or you're not landing them in the right spot. And those are places to continually look at in terms of optimizing your program. You want to make sure they're spending as much time on the site as possible, right? Because, you know, the longer they spend on the site with engaging content, the more likely they are to do what you want them to do ultimately, right? So that's another one to keep look at. And then one that I didn't list on here is obviously pages per session, right? When they're on the site, how many pages of content are they looking at? Because if it's 1, then they're probably not very interested. And if it's 25, they're probably very interested. And so that allows you to identify pockets of individuals who are high quality or high value in terms of maybe additional marketing, for example. One thing that Google Analytics does a poor job of tracking is your media cost, especially outside of Google products like paid search. So there are some important marketing metrics that Google Analytics by itself is not necessarily going to be a good help for. And understanding your cost per click, understanding your click-through rate, understanding your cost per lead, these are all things that are media optimization metrics, and they typically are not something that's readily available or easily done in Google Analytics besides specifically Google paid search. So with properly implemented goals and events, the acquisition tab is really the best place to be evaluating marketing efforts generally, right? And then depending on the different lenses through which you need to understand more detail, right, you'll jump to different sections of Google Analytics or look at, you know, flows or funnels or things like that to understand, you know, what's causing people to drop out, basically. The next question we got is, what should college marketers keep in mind when working with agencies and sharing data and analytics? So one of the things to keep in mind is that it's very important to ensure that your agencies are properly tagging their link URLs with purposeful UTM parameters that allow you to see how the media that they're running for you is performing once it gets to your website. Otherwise, if they don't, then that traffic will get treated as a referral, and you won't really know like how the agency campaign or program is working. So a lot of this happens in pre-planning. How are we going to tag this campaign so that we can identify the people coming from it so that we can determine whether the campaign is working or not? And it's a conversation that's always important to have up front and to have a consistent strategy in place in terms of how we're going to track and segment the traffic from the work that an agency is doing for you. All too often, media agencies will only want to think about CTR, which is how many people clicked on my banner. But really what matters is what those users do once they get to your site. And so your agency should also be implementing their own conversion tracking in their own programs that mirrors the way that Google Analytics has been tracking events and goals. Now, your agency programs may only want to to implement a conversion to track the goals. They don't have to track every event the way that web analytics is going to, but you definitely want them to be tracking something, right, that gives them an indication that their program is doing and driving people that are doing what we want them to do. And so a lot of times, especially with media agencies that like to focus on branding, they're not so much, they don't feel like it's their job to worry about what happens when a user gets to the site. And the truth is that's just not true, because you can drive traffic to the site all day, but if the traffic stinks and it's not sticky, then you're wasting your money. Agencies will often use other platforms to report similar metrics. So when an agency is working a program for you and they say, oh, we drove 100 clicks. Well, what they're saying is that they're generating 100 sessions in Google Analytics. But if you look at what they're reporting to what your Google Analytics is reporting, you're never really going to get the exact same answer, because tracking systems are flawed. There's obviously a degree of bot traffic that happens that gets filtered out. And there's, but generally they should line up, right? So if your agency reports to you 100 clicks and you see, 90 sessions, you're probably okay, right? If your agency is reporting 1,000 clicks and you're seeing 20 sessions, well, maybe the media is not being tagged properly. And then lastly, from a data security perspective, Google Analytics is not going to store personally identifiable information. So it's really safe in that regard in terms of sharing with agency partners. Now, the caveat here, though, is that if you provide Google Analytics to your agency partners, you allow them to see everything, right? Which may include what other marketing efforts are happening that they're not doing, or that another agency or that's a competitor to them is doing. And so sometimes it can make sense to create specific views of Google Analytics that are filtered to only the traffic driven from your agency partner. And so that allows them to see very clearly, here's what the traffic is doing from my campaigns, but it doesn't necessarily give them full visibility into the entire system, because you may not want them to have that for some reason. And then the only other thing that tends to happen is that agency partners love to get their hands on PII data because they can use it for modeling. And a lot of the platforms that they work in can ingest it and use it for modeling. So if you are going to share your PII data, AKA customer data, AKA enrollment data, be sure that that's done securely via SFTP or another secure data transfer method. And do not email spreadsheets with people's names and email addresses over email. It's not a good idea. If anything, it can open you up to having your data stolen. So that's always a big one. And so typically your agency partner should be able to set up an SFTP, or you should be able to work with your internal IT team to set one up for your agency partner to access.
Okay, Sean, I have a couple of questions, not so much related to specifically this question, kind of going back a little bit.
Sure.
How should we analyze a high number of low sessions on a page? They clicked one thing and then left quickly.
I mean, if they clicked
what would you think? I guess the question, and definitely correct me, contributor. I guess it's, if they are seeing in Google Analytics a high number of low sessions on a specific page, but they bounced quickly.
Right. So
is that user experience versus valuable content sought?
It could be two different things, right? If your pages are experiencing a high bounce rate, which means you have a lot of sessions that are happening, but then a lot of people leave immediately, it typically indicates one of two things. It indicates the people landing there are not the people, like, don't care about that content. They're the wrong people, right? And oftentimes with a media program, you can target the wrong audience and land them in the wrong spot, right? Like, I have this content geared towards students, but I'm landing a lot of grandparents here. It doesn't make any sense. They just leave, right? It's not what they're looking for. The other piece is that it's the right audience, right? But the content isn't resonating with them. It's not actually answering what that audience wants to know. And so it can be either of those things. And so that's why you have to continually kind of build a testing plan to say, is it an issue with the content not satisfying what the user interest is? And you can often implement things like surveys to ask, why are you leaving? Or what were you really looking for? Things like that to try to get some feedback so that you can improve your site experience. Or you go to your marketing team and you say, hey, listen, I got this content. It's designed for this kind of person and you're not sending me them. And so your marketing team needs to go and say, okay, well, how do we pivot our campaigns so that we're driving the right kind of traffic to this content, so it means something to them.
Got it. This question is very interesting. Our site audience is a mix of current students and prospective students. Is there a way to differentiate or group between the two audiences as they enter and then segment and follow their activity following?
Generally, yes, right? The best way to do that is your current students probably log in whenever they come to the site. And so usually a login page is a really good way to bifurcate traffic between, current students and prospective students. There's other ways to do it. Obviously, you can, try to onboard your enrollment data to identify the traffic coming in, things like that. But generally what we see is that a current student will come in and do very specific things on the website. And so you take those specific things and you tag them in a way that allows you to separate the two, right? People who are doing this are likely current students, and people who are not doing that are likely prospects. And then you can create either different properties or different views to really just look at that specific group of people. Did that help answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much.
And Sandra, I'm going to just really quickly, I know we've got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I don't have necessarily a hard stop. So if people want to ask a few more questions afterwards, that's fine. But in the chat, I am going to put just a link for folks if you want to share some of your feedback. If you have some additional questions or something that you want to share, then drop them in that form. And so y'all are welcome to stay and chat as long as need be. But I know we're coming up on the hour, so want to be sure to let everybody know that's there.
We obviously don't ever get every question answered right away, or your question is very specific to you. So that's why, but we will answer every question. So feel free to email it to Sandra or through the form, and we can either answer it for you or we can schedule some time to talk about it. One of the questions we had is Google Analytics the best platform to use, or are there other platforms to look at? Well, Google Analytics is the go-to solution for the vast majority of the web, right? It's used by over 50% of all internet websites to track user activity, which is like 10x more than any other single web analytics tool. And it's generally free unless you need specific advanced features, which is why everybody uses it. So it's been around a long time. It's been, battle tested, and they're constantly iterating on it. And it's one of their core products, and Google gives it away for free so that they can see as much about the internet as possible. That being said, there are other web analytics tools that are pay to play, right? Like Adobe or Core Metrics by IBM or Mixpanel, among others. And these tools will do the same things as Google Analytics, but they'll do them in different ways, right? So you'll understand the key concepts that we've talked about today using other tools, but they'll have different methods and approaches for doing that, right? And then again, some tools are actually more specialized in certain elements of web and app analytics than others, right? So Google Analytics and Adobe are, what you would consider to be general web analytics solutions, right? You get a general understanding of what's going on your site. But there are specialized tools if you want to optimize specific content, that are really dedicated to serving that specific purpose only. And like, they won't give you an overview of your whole site, but they'll definitely break down with heat maps and things like that how specific content works. So again, it goes back to understanding what your needs are and why. And then from there, you can identify, is the tool that we have the best tool, or do we need to explore a third-party solution? That may be a paid-for solution. And then lastly, Google Analytics is not intended to provide media optimization data like that's outside of the website. It's strictly providing what happens when users are at your website and why. Right? The questions about who we're reaching and who we're marketing to and what the frequency is and all that, that's not going to be Google Analytics. You're going to use other tools for that. What are the main KPIs, conversions, and goals, and how do we know if we're meeting them? Well, determining whether you're meeting goals like you want starts with understanding what your business metrics and objectives are. And then from there, we develop targeted questions about the business, and then we start to apply them and work our way back into the analytics data from there. So as a quick example, how much revenue do we want to earn this year? How much of the revenue comes from a single enrollment? Well, that tells us how many enrollments I need. What percentage of leads tend to convert to an enrollment? Okay, well, if I want 100 enrollments and I have a conversion rate of 10%, I know I need 1,000 leads. What percentage of sessions tend to convert to a lead? Well, 10% of sessions do that. Well, if I have if I need 1,000 leads and 10% of sessions convert to a lead, then I need 10,000 sessions in order to get 10,000 leads, or in order to get 1,000 leads. Well, then how many sessions do we need to drive to the site in order to have X number of enrollments? And how many of that sessions are going to happen organically? And how much of it are we going to have to pay for through some kind of media or marketing effort? And then what marketing channels are driving those sessions most efficiently from a cost perspective? Because media is more or less expensive depending on what kind of media that you're buying. So again, you start to like critically think about your business, and then you can back into, okay, well, knowing that I need 10,000 sessions to get 100 enrollments, right? Then I need my cost per session to be maxed out at X. And you can start to apply data-driven analysis in order to understand how to create goals for yourself, and then create the views in Google Analytics that allow you to see whether or not you're meeting those goals.
How many of y'all just went, whoo?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, again, that's why we help you with this, right? Because this doesn't come intuitively to a lot of people as how you break it down into a math problem, basically. One of the interesting questions was, what's the transition from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4 would look like, and what are the key differences? And when do we need to plan on making the switch? Well, the transition from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4 is an important one, right? So we recommend switching as soon as possible. But that being said, there's fundamental differences in terms of how Google Analytics 4 tracks things compared to Universal Analytics. So it's not going to necessarily be an apples to apples when you're looking at reporting before versus reporting after. And so that can be a bit of a process to basically digest and understand what this means for how you think about your website. Additionally, when you migrate, you're going to have to migrate all your events and all your goal completions and anything that you have implemented via Google Tag Manager or any other web dev solution. And you're going to need a project plan for doing that, right? Because you're going to want to migrate some stuff, but some stuff is probably not relevant anymore and you don't care about. And so you have to spend some time to do that deliberately for it to end up with a meaningful end result once you've transitioned. And so again, you would engage with a company like ours to help you develop that plan or even do that work for you. GA4, while very powerful in its current iteration, though, it's still in beta, right? And so you don't have to do it right now, right? However, it won't be in beta forever. And the earlier that you can transition to it and start to look at it side by side with what your Universal Analytics looks like, the better you'll be prepared for when Google finally says, okay, everybody has to do this, right? So again, don't have to do it right now, but if you have the bandwidth, it's probably a good idea to start. So after this presentation, which Michael Scott are you? Are you, it's a Brittany, I'm Brittany? Are you, I'm scared? Or are you looking at Dementors?
This made me crack up.
So again, we've glossed over it, a lot of detail, right? Like Google Analytics has a ton more than this that you can do. We wanted to keep it as straightforward as possible in terms of meat and potatoes. But again, if you want to get into the details or understand specific subsections in more detail, then obviously send us a note, send an email, schedule a meeting, and we're happy to do a deep dive with you to get you more acclimated to some of the finer points, especially if you need to update your implementations too, right? That's the hard part, but it gets really technical from there.
Yeah, and Sandra and I have been kind of chatting via text as well on the side, and so there's some opportunities as well. If there was something that really caught your eye in this session, and there's enough people that want to do a deep dive on a particular subject, then we can maybe schedule another time, either during a lunch and learn or another time during the week to deep dive in that. So be sure to let us know if there is something like, man, I really want to know about acquisitions, or I really want to know about events. How does that look? Then be sure to let us know. Reach out to me or reach out to Sandra or something, and we may be able to schedule some more conversations as well around this. So Sean and Sandra, I really appreciate y'all joining us. I know Heather had to jump off quickly, but I appreciate y'all joining us and sharing all of this.
I think this is
great information for everybody. And I really hope that everybody can walk away with something good and at least one takeaway for the afternoon.
That's right. And we'll share out this presentation with the group at large, either as a PDF or a direct link to the Google Slides, and just let us know how we can help.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
You too.
Bye-bye.